wealthy CEO, a simple phone call, and a child's whisper on the other end shattered his entire world. Blake Harrison was the definition of success. He didn't come from privilege. He built it all himself, from a basement in Brooklyn to the top floor of a glass tower in San Francisco. He created everything. Empire Solutions, a multi-billion-dollar tech empire, where productivity was sacred and emotions were a luxury. Every morning, he arrived at the office before the sun. Black coffee, neatly stacked documents, meetings timed down to the minute. Blake didn't believe in stories. He believed in results. Until that morning, a routine call, just to terminate a janitor who'd missed 3 days of work without notice. A quick task, not even a full minute. He dialed the number, ready to end the contract, just like dozens of times before. But when the call connected, it wasn't a tired woman's voice on the line. It was a little girl. Her voice trembled, tiny and fragile, like it was slipping through the wires of the world. "Please don't fire my mommy." 5 words. But they didn't just make him pause. They pierced through the cold armor he'd worn for 15 years as CEO. Someone once said, "The biggest shifts in life often begin with the smallest moments." And in that moment, Blake realized he had drifted too far from what really matters. This isn't a story about power or business. It's a story about a man who forgot how to be human, until a child reminded him with nothing but a whisper. Blake Harrison sat in his 57th floor office at Empire Tower, a space so flawless it felt inhuman. Cold morning light reflected off the glass walls. Not a speck on the desk. Everything in its place, on schedule, by the book. He was reviewing reports when his assistant knocked, softly, as if afraid to break the silence. "Mr. Harrison, Rosa, the janitor, still hasn't returned. This is the 3rd day. No official reason given. Would you like to proceed with termination?" Blake didn't look up, too minor to deserve his time, but just big enough to irritate him. "No one skips work for 3 days without consequences," he said flatly, as if reading from a spreadsheet. "Give me her number." The assistant handed over a note. The digits were scribbled messy. Something about it felt out of place in Blake's precisely engineered world. He dialed, pressing each number like resetting a malfunctioning system. The line connected. Blake didn't wait for a greeting. "Mrs. Rosa, this is Blake Harrison from Empire. I'm calling to..." "Hello?" A small voice. Trembling. A child. Blake froze. "Sorry. Mommy can't come to the phone right now. She's lying down. She's sick." Silence. He swallowed. "Who am I speaking to?" "I'm Ellie. I'm 6. A breath. Deep. Heavy. Blake could almost hear his own heartbeat. "Ellie, can you tell your mom she doesn't need to worry about work right now, okay?" I will. But, Mr. Yes. You're not gonna fire her, right? We don't have much food left." That line hit him like a punch to the chest. It wasn't a complaint. Not a demand. Just a little girl trying to be the adult, because her mom couldn't. Blake's voice came out lower. Real. Almost unfamiliar. "No, Ellie. I won't. I promise." On the other end, he heard a soft exhale. Barely a breath, but somehow it felt like the most precious thing in the world. Trust. The call ended. Blake set the phone down and stared at the floor-to-ceiling glass. The city was still spinning outside, but inside something had cracked. Not the company, not the process. Him. For the first time in years, Blake stood up, not to walk into a meeting, but to search for something far more important. The part of himself he had long forgotten. Blake Harrison left his office, and the entire floor froze. He had never walked out of Empire Tower in the middle of a workday, especially not for a janitor. But this time, it wasn't business. This time, he was following a voice, a whisper so small, so fragile. It pulled him away from every spreadsheet and executive meeting. His black Bentley slipped through the fast lanes of Manhattan. But instead of heading toward his usual destinations, he typed a new address into the GPS, hastily scribbled on Rosa's HR file. 83A Quincy Street, Flatbush, Brooklyn. Blake had never driven there. In fact, just the mention of the neighborhood once made his finance team suggest switching to a more reliable cleaning contractor. But today, he needed to see it for himself. The neighborhood unfolded around him. Faded brick walls, tangled power lines, rows of aging buildings standing shoulder to shoulder. Kids ran along cracked sidewalks. A woman sold fruit outside a laundromat. Everything was unfamiliar. And yet, for the first time, Blake didn't feel afraid. He felt present. He parked the car, stepped out, and walked up to apartment 4A. The door was chipped, the doorknob rusted. No buzzer. He knocked gently. A pause. Then, the door creaked open. And just as he imagined, she stood there. Ellie, the little girl from the phone call. She gripped the hem of her shirt, her wide eyes immediately recognizing him. "You're the man who called?" she whispered. Blake nodded, crouching to meet her eyes. "I came to check if your mom's okay. Is it alright if I come in?" Ellie hesitated, then turned. "Mommy, someone's here." No response. A beat passed. Then Ellie stepped aside and opened the door wider, motioning for him to come in. The apartment was small, peeling paint, worn-out furniture. But it was clean. Clean in the way of someone who's holding on to the last threads of dignity through sickness and poverty. On a threadbare sofa lay Rosa, her face pale, eyes sunken, too tired to lift her head. Blake stood still. For the first time in his life, he was face to face with one of the hundreds of names he'd seen on payroll reports, and realized none of those names ever had a face, a voice, a daughter, a fear. Ellie tiptoed over with a damp cloth and gently wiped her mother's forehead. "I do this every morning. It helps her feel less hot," she said softly, like she was explaining a protocol, just like adults do in meetings. Blake clenched his fists. He hadn't spoken a single word yet, but inside, every blueprint of his life had just shifted. A life that once looked like a linear growth chart had now curved sharply into unknown territory, where compassion outweighed performance, and feelings dared to override metrics. He no longer knew what the right decision was, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't leave this apartment and let Ellie be the adult one more day. Blake sat quietly on a wobbly wooden chair, facing Rosa. The apartment was far too small by any standard he'd ever known. Ellie sat curled up beside her mother, hands clasped tightly in her lap, as if she was trying to hold herself together. There was no sound in the room, except for the ticking of an old, crooked clock on the wall. And for the first time in 15 years as a CEO, Blake Harrison felt completely useless. "Has she seen a doctor yet?" His voice was softer than even he expected. Ellie shook her head slowly. "Mom said, if she goes to the doctor, she'll have to miss more work. And if she misses work, we won't have money for medicine. So she didn't go." Blake clenched his fists. In his world, people took time off for rest and recovery. Here, taking time off meant survival. Or not. He pulled out his phone and dialed. "Sophie," he said to his most trusted executive assistant. "I need a doctor. General physician. House call. Urgent. I'll text the address." Sophie sounded surprised. "Sir, to Brooklyn?" "Yes. And send a medical support fund. $10,000. Label it personal emergency assistance. Not deducted from salary. No repayment required." There was a pause on the other end. Then, "Understood. I'll take care of it immediately." He ended the call. When he looked up, Ellie was staring at him. "Is there anything else I can do?" Her voice was so small, it almost vanished into the room. Blake stood, walked over, and knelt beside her. He had never been good with feelings. But in this moment, every business metric, every rule of leadership felt meaningless. "You've done more than anyone could ever ask," he said, looking into her soft, pale blue eyes. "Now it's the grown-ups' turn to do their job." From the couch, Rosa stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, faint and glassy. She tried to speak, but her voice barely came through. "I don't need charity." Blake shook his head. "This isn't charity. It's something I should have done a long time ago." He walked over, took a bottle of water from his bag, and placed it gently beside the couch. "The doctor's on their way. And after that, we're going to talk about how you won't need to worry about your job or your paycheck." Rosa turned her face away, and a single tear slid down her cheek. Ellie looked at her mother, then at Blake. She couldn't fully understand why the man, who once called to fire her mom, was now sitting in their tiny, crumbling apartment. Like family. Blake sat down at the edge of the couch, his hand resting gently on the blanket. He said nothing more, not because he had nothing left to say, but because he understood something now. Sometimes, silence is the only way someone truly believes you're staying. And for the first time in years, Blake Harrison was no longer the man who had to control everything. He was simply a man, learning how to be human again. The doctor arrived at 11:12 a.m. She was in her early 50s, streaks of gray in her tied-back hair, glasses hanging from a cord, and a weathered leather bag slung over her shoulder. Her name was Dr. Evelyn Brooks, sent by Blake from a private clinic in Manhattan. She didn't ask many questions, But she instantly understood this wasn't just a medical case. It was the weight in the room, the quiet, heavy presence of a man standing beside the bed, as if trying to carry something far greater than himself. "We'll need a bit of privacy," Dr. Brooks said softly. Blake nodded and stepped outside with Ellie, leaving Rosa and the doctor in the sunlight-drenched room. Ellie fidgeted constantly, twisting her fingers together. Blake sat still, staring at the floor like it held the answer to questions he hadn't yet found the courage to ask. 18 minutes later, Dr. Brooks emerged. Her expression hadn't changed much, but something in her eyes had. She leaned down, whispered something to Ellie, then turned to Blake. "She needs rest," she began. "But there's something you should know, if you really care." Blake nodded. "Tell me." Rosa was diagnosed with congestive heart failure over a year ago. It wasn't severe at first, but without proper treatment, it progresses fast. And just as I suspected, she stopped taking her medication nearly 4 months ago. Blake frowned, his voice low. "Why?" "Because her insurance stopped covering it, and she used the money instead to buy food and cold medicine for her daughter." He didn't respond, just clenched his fists so tightly his fingernails pressed into his palms through the fabric of his suit pants. Dr. Brooks continued, "We can help her recover, but we can't if she keeps believing that staying alive is a burden." Blake only nodded again, as if words were useless in this moment. After the doctor left, he returned to the small room. Rosa lay still, eyes avoiding his gaze, a habit born from years of survival, not shame. "I know," he said quietly, sitting beside the bed. "I know everything now." Rosa turned her face away. "I wasn't trying to hide it forever. I just didn't want to be a problem. I've lived my whole life that way. No asking, no owing." Blake replied softly, "But no one was meant to carry everything alone, Rosa. Especially not when there's a child watching, learning how to endure, instead of learning how to live." Silence. And then the tears came, from eyes that had long forgotten how. "Then what do I do now?" Her voice cracked, barely more than a whisper. Blake stood, walking to the window. Outside, Brooklyn was not beautiful, not loud, but it was real. "Now let me do my part," he said, "and let Ellie go back to being a child, not a stand-in adult." He turned to face her. Rosa was no longer just a name on a termination list. She was a mother who had traded sleep and health and comfort for the simple hope that her daughter would eat tonight. "You don't have to do this alone anymore, Rosa." And for the first time since they met, she didn't push back. She just nodded, no more resistance, no more pretending to be stronger than she was. And the tears that followed weren't shame. They were a silent yes, the kind that changes everything. The next morning, Blake didn't show up to the office. Not because he forgot, but because, for the first time in years, he wanted to be absent. Meetings were canceled. His phone was off. The CEO of Holden Enterprises had disappeared from the schedule. Not because of a crisis, but because of a 7-year-old girl, and a mother fighting to stay alive. Blake showed up at Rosa's apartment with a large paper bag in hand. Inside, hot chicken soup, a thermos of ginger tea, heart-healthy milk, and a cream-colored envelope. When Mia opened the door, her eyes lit up, like the sun breaking through a winter sky. "You're up early," he said, kneeling to meet her gaze. "I wanted to make sure you'd come back." She whispered, "I was afraid yesterday was a dream." Blake froze. Something inside him went completely still. "It wasn't a dream, Mia, and I've got a lot more to do for you and your mom." He handed her the bag and stepped inside. Rosa was on the couch, still thin, still weak, but her eyes had a spark of life again. He placed the envelope on the side table beside her and nodded toward it. Inside, a newly issued debit card with enough balance to cover 6 months of living expenses. A full appointment schedule at the best cardiac center in Brooklyn. A signed confirmation from Holden Enterprises. Rosa was granted fully paid leave during her entire recovery. Rosa looked at him, stunned. "Blake, I can't accept this." He gently cut her off, his voice soft but unwavering. "You worked 6 straight years, never took a single day off. You cleaned up everything I left behind, and never once complained. You gave more to this company than people I pay 7 figures to. This isn't a gift. It's just a piece of what's fair." Then his voice lowered. "And I'm not here out of pity. I'm here because I think I'm starting to need you and Mia in my life." Rosa didn't speak. Her eyes welled with tears, but they didn't fall. No one had ever said anything like that to her before. Blake turned to Mia, pulling a brand new coloring book from his coat. Didn't we have a tulip coloring date to get to? Mia burst into laughter, a sound so clear and bright. It echoed through a home that hadn't heard joy in far too long. Blake stayed until evening that day, and none of them realized it yet. But they had just taken the first steps into something greater than kindness. A family, not bound by blood, but by the simple choice to stay. Monday morning, Holden Enterprises rose like a steel monolith into the gray Manhattan sky. Inside, assistants scrambled, prepping for the weekly executive meeting. Everyone expected the usual, a long slide deck, a few cold nods from the famously detached CEO, and back to business as usual. But that morning, Ryan Blake walked through the lobby holding the hand of a 7-year-old girl, Mia. She wore a simple white dress, clutching a stuffed bear, her wide eyes scanning the towering glass and marble with a mixture of fear and wonder. Employees paused, heads turning. No one dared ask, but the questions hung in the air like static. In the elevator, Mia looked up. "Are you sure I'm allowed to come with you?" Blake smiled, for the first time in years. "Today, you're the reason I'm here." The doors opened to the 30th floor. The meeting began, just like always, slides, charts, polite handshakes, data points no one would remember. Then it was Blake's turn. But he didn't walk to the podium. Instead, he pulled a chair to the center of the room and gently helped Mia onto it. "Before we talk about quarterly profits," he said, voice low but clear enough to stop every breath in the room, "I want you to meet this little girl." Every eye turned. Mia looked nervous but didn't cry. Blake continued, "Last week, I made a phone call to terminate a janitor who had missed 2 days of work without notice. But instead of an excuse, I heard the voice of a child. For simple words, 'We need the money.' And suddenly, everything I thought mattered didn't." He paused, letting the silence settle. "We built this company on discipline, speed, and profit. But I forgot that beneath every spreadsheet, there are human lives. There are people surviving on the paychecks we sign. And children like Mia, carrying burdens we've never had to even think about." The boardroom was silent, as if the stock market itself had stopped breathing. "Starting today," Blake declared, "we're creating an employee emergency relief fund. No one will be fired for being sick without asking why. No one should have to choose between working and surviving." Mia glanced at him, tightening her grip on his hand. Blake looked down and smiled. "And I'm done running this company like a machine without a heart." From the end of the table, one executive asked quietly, "What if the shareholders don't approve?" Blake's mouth curled slightly. "Then they can find someone else to run it. Because I'm not selling my soul, not one more day." His voice didn't shake. No one laughed, and no one objected. Because in that moment, even the coldest people in the room understood. Some things are bigger than money. 1 week after the speech that stunned an entire corporation, the media caught wind. Millionaire CEO brings 7-year-old to company boardroom. What's happening at Holden Enterprises? Headlines exploded. Some called it a PR stunt. Others mocked Blake, saying he'd finally lost touch after too many years at the top. But those who stayed after that meeting, those who saw the way Blake looked at Mia, like she was his own daughter, they knew. None of it was an act. Blake brought Mia to the office 3 days a week. Not as an obligation, but as a living reminder that behind every number, there is a name, a life, a story. He spent his lunch breaks playing tic-tac-toe with her, then walked her around the rooftop garden, once reserved only for VIPs. Mia's favorite spot, the piano in the main conference room, a room where Blake once signed million-dollar deals without flinching. Now she sat at that same piano, playing slow, careful notes her mother had taught her, and Blake would just sit and listen, still, quiet, like a man relearning how to feel alive. But not everyone shared his vision. A group of major shareholders began pushing back. A secret meeting was called. The topic, concerning signs of emotional mismanagement within the executive leadership. That day, Blake was slicing apples for Mia in the office kitchen when the intercom buzzed. "Mr. Blake, you're needed in the boardroom. 28th floor. Urgent." Mia looked up, her eyes wide. Blake squeezed her hand gently. "It's okay, kiddo. I'll be back in just a minute." 28th floor. The air was heavy with suspicion. Eyes sharp as needles. "We respect your service, Blake," said a silver-haired man. "But this company cannot be run on emotion. The market is losing confidence. Stocks are slipping." Blake crossed his arms calm. "A few points lost in exchange for a company with a soul. I'll take that trade. And if we don't..." He stood, Then I'll step down, but make sure the entire staff knows. I chose to be a human being before being a boss. He walked out, leaving behind stunned silence. And in that moment, Blake knew. He no longer belonged in a world of cold handshakes and lifeless reports. He belonged elsewhere, where a little girl offered him a homemade cookie when he looked sad, where a recovering mother stood taller each day because someone finally believed in her worth beyond her sick days. And he didn't need another CEO title to know. He was leading something greater than a company. He was leading change. 1 week after Ryan Blake walked out of the 28th floor boardroom, not defeated, but steady, like a man who'd finally found himself, America started hearing a new name: the Mia and Grace Foundation. It wasn't the sort of glossy charity the business pages love to quote. It was a human movement, sparked by a 30-second phone call from a 7-year-old brave enough to answer for her mother. Ryan named the foundation after the two souls who had saved his life. Mia, the wide-eyed girl with a fearless heart. Grace, the quiet mother who taught Blake his first real lesson in patience and kindness, without uttering a single sermon. The mission was disarmingly simple: give safety, healing, and a fighting chance to the invisible workers who keep our cities clean and orderly, yet whose names no one remembers. Within 3 months, thousands of letters poured into headquarters, from everyday people to venture capital giants. Many wrote that they had once been another Mrs. Brown, too afraid to call in sick. Some said they'd grown up like Mia, wide awake at 2 a.m. because mom's cough wouldn't stop. Mia herself chose the foundation's logo, a coiled telephone handset, symbolizing the call that changed everything. The launch. Blake brought Mia to the launch event at Columbia University. She wore a simple white dress and clutched her pencil-written speech. When the MC called her name, she glanced at Blake for courage. He nodded, smiling, and whispered, "Just speak the way you spoke to me, from the heart." Mia stepped to the mic, hands trembling, voice soft but sure. "I don't know about money. I don't really know what a foundation is. But I know there are moms who work even when they're sick. I know there are kids like me who have to grow up too fast. I just hope somebody will listen to moms like mine. Listen to people like my mom." The hall went silent. Then, row by row, people stood. Not out of politeness, but because a child had reminded them of something basic. The weakest voices deserved to be heard first. A Harvard professor pledged an honorary scholarship for Grace once she recovered. A national grocery chain promised to rehire any employee who'd quit for medical reasons, because no one had ever asked why. And somewhere beyond the camera lights, fathers started going home earlier, just to read bedtime stories. All of it because of one phone call and 4 whispered words: "Mommy isn't well." A year after one small phone call changed a man and sparked a movement. The skyscraper once branded Blake Capital bore a different name: the listening room. It wasn't official, not on legal documents, but to every employee, it was the name that mattered, spoken naturally with quiet reverence. Ryan Blake still sat on the top floor, but the polished mahogany desk was gone. No more towering stacks of color-coded folders. No more fortress of silence. In its place, a small round table, with one chair always left empty, for anyone who needed to be heard. On the first staff meeting of the new year, Blake didn't open with a PowerPoint. He didn't quote projections or discuss margins. He set his phone down, looked each person in the eye, and said, "Before we talk numbers, I want to tell you a story about a little girl named Mia." The room fell still. They'd heard her name before, but they had never really listened. So Blake told it, every word. No embellishment, no theatrics, just truth. That sometimes the most powerful CEO is the one who needs to be awakened. And that sometimes the whisper of a 7-year-old can echo through a man's soul louder than any boardroom applause. When he finished, no one clapped. They just sat there, silent, changed. That afternoon, Mia returned to the building. Not because her mom worked there, but because she was now an honored guest. She sat on her mother's lap, hair neatly braided, wearing a simple blue dress Grace had sewn herself. Once again, she was invited to the stage. But this time, she didn't need a speech. "I want a room," Mia said softly, "where people can tell stories. They don't have to be grown-ups. They don't have to be strong. They just need someone to listen." Ryan nodded. No hesitation. A room was built on the 3rd floor. Not a boardroom, not a lounge, just a space with soft chairs, an old telephone, and a sign on the wall that read, "You are heard. You matter." From that day on, every week, employees would step into that room. from janitors to department heads, not to complain, but to speak truths they'd buried for years. Because now, they knew someone was listening. And Ryan? He no longer needed speeches. He didn't need headlines or stock surges. He had built something no wealth had ever brought him before. A place where people no longer felt invisible. Maybe Ryan Blake never imagined that what people would remember him for wasn't the billion-dollar deals, wasn't his name etched on the tallest tower in Chicago, but a moment, a phone call, and the voice of a child who simply said, "My mom can't get out of bed, but if you need, I can come clean for her." Sometimes the world shifts, not because of grand decisions, but because of the smallest acts of courage. Because a child chose to speak up, when all the adults stayed silent. And sometimes we don't need to be heroes. We just need to be listeners. Ryan once believed power meant control, but now he knows. True strength is choosing to slow down, sit beside someone and ask, "Are you okay?" And listening with your whole heart. Today, on the third floor of that building, there's still an empty chair in the listening room. Anyone can sit there. No title required. No explanation needed. Just the courage to speak. And someone beside you with the courage to truly hear. And if you're watching this right now, I just want to tell you one thing from the heart. You may not have millions like Ryan. You may not run a company, but you have something far more powerful. The ability to make someone feel less alone. A simple check-in. A look that says, "I see you." A quiet message. "I'm here if you need me." You never know. Sometimes that alone can save a life. In a world that moves too fast, take the time to slow down and truly see someone. Because being seen, being heard, can be the beginning of everything. If you believe that even the smallest act of kindness can create a miracle, like, share, and subscribe to help spread stories that touch the heart. And if today you feel weak, remember this. Someone out there is listening, and you are never alone.